Much has been written about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, comparing and contrasting it to its source material, the book written by Stephen King. But it seems there's one aspect most people haven't discussed, namely the ending, which varied wildly between the movie and book. Is this the rare case in which the movie is more artistic than the book? And that it's the book that has the more conventional Hollywood blockbuster-style ending. Typically, we expect the source material to be more artistic and the movie adaptation to cut important bits of story or characterization to get a shorter runtime, and to structure the film in a more palatable way to general audiences, theoretically maximizing the potential for ticket sales. It's long been a Hollywood rule of thumb that the more traditional the approach to storytelling is, it'll increasingly appeal to the widest possible audience. Often as a creator experiments with the artistic medium and subverts expectations, it's natural that the audience for that work will narrow. Thus, we often refer to those stories or films as more artistic, versus films from traditional storytelling constraints as more commercial. But to be clear, despite these words sometimes referring to the quality of a work, I'm not implying the inherent quality. I'm not saying whether it means the work is good or bad. This is simply one of many lenses of analysis. Imagine a spectrum with a scale of 1 to 10. 1 represents the most commercial films, broad in content, stuff that's palatable to the widest audience. The stories and characters are easily recognizable. There's a clear good versus bad. At the very end of the spectrum, they're so safe and simple as to be dull and dim-witted. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the artistic film. Characters and stories are more complex. Story structures may be non-linear. And at the very end of the spectrum is non-narrative experimental films. We can see how the spectrum plays out by comparing two movies largely set in space. Star Wars clearly has many of the elements we would see on the commercial end of the spectrum. It was designed to be a piece of modern myth-making for people of all ages. George Lucas even said as much soon after he made it in a quote that's a little ironic today. Now take a look at 2001: A Space Odyssey. First of all, it's slow as molasses in January. There's not even dialogue in the film until 20 minutes into it. And it has a confusing story structure, cold and ambiguous characters, and really no central character at all. The closest thing to such is astronaut Dave Bowman, and he doesn't even show up until an hour into the film. At times, the film is so confusing and ambiguous that many viewers at certain points didn't even understand what was happening. It's a masterclass in subverting audience expectations. Instead of fun and exciting pacing, it's literally difficult to watch. You have to be ready to engage its challenging narrative on its own terms. Both of these films are among the most important in history, but it's pretty obvious why one is a more commercial success while the other film's artistic flourishes appeal to a much more select demographic. Of course, in practice, movies are complex and most will have a mixture of both commercial and artistic elements, so we're generalizing a little bit here. But now that we've established this metric, how does The Shining movie's ending stack up with the book? As the story reaches its climax, Jack Nicholson's character, Jack Torrance, is under the spell of the hotel's evil forces and is on a murderous rampage after his wife Wendy and son Danny. This much is generally in line with the book, but Kubrick's version diverts from there, ending with Jack chasing Danny outside and into the hedge maze. Through a clever bit of ingenuity, Danny backtracks in his footprints, allowing him to sneak away, exiting the maze, reuniting with his mother, and both of them escaping. Tricked and confused, Jack continues to wander deeper into the maze, and increasingly his mania, his injuries, and the extreme cold are taking their toll until he finally stops to rest. Then we hard cut to, he's dead, frozen to death in the maze which he had intended to kill his son. That image of Nicholson has become iconic, and the ending a horror classic, but have you ever stopped to consider just how strange it is, especially within the horror genre? For starters, traditionally, it's the hero of the movie that metaphorically slays the dragon. In most horror movies, after all the terror and scares, it's standard to give the audience that cathartic moment of seeing the hero defeat the villain or monster, a visual representation of good prevailing over evil.
You're a terminated fucker.
You could argue that Danny's tricking Jack led him further into the maze and getting him lost, but it's still a rather passive victory. Now that's not unheard of, sometimes the bad guy even gets killed by his own actions, but a second way Kubrick's film subverts the genre is how Jack is killed. He's killed by cold weather. Of course, it's one of the first things they teach you in middle school literature class, the 3 types of conflict in fiction, but it's pretty unexpected that a horror movie villain is going to be killed off by something you'd find in a Jack London novel. A third way this ending is unique to the genre, and this may be the most amazing of all, because Jack Torrance is actually killed off-screen. Yes, not only do we not see the hero kill the villain, we don't see him die at all. We go right from him sitting down to a hard cut the morning after when he's long dead. How often does that happen, especially in a horror movie? Seeing the villain or monster meet their demise, usually at the hands of the hero, is a basic. It's Hollywood 101. It's a standard not just for horror movies, but movies in general. Kubrick's creative choices were so unusual it drastically subverts the audience expectations, and despite the apparent happy ending, there's even a hint of ambiguity as only Jack Torrance is killed, presumably leaving the evil spirits of the Overlook Hotel to live on to terrorize new victims in the future. Naturally, because of all these subversions of horror genre tropes, we'd have to move The Shining away from the commercial side of the spectrum. But what about the book? Of course, Stephen King famously hated the Kubrick adaptation with a passion due to the changes he made, largely cutting out or at least minimizing Jack Torrance's alcoholism, which was a personal part of the story for King as it was informed by his own real-life struggles with alcohol. King's anger at the movie eventually resulted in his own adaptation of the novel as a 6-hour TV miniseries. But Kubrick's movie changed much more than just Jack's drinking. One key plot point that was cut from the movie but restored for King's TV miniseries was the subplot of the rickety old boiler in the hotel's basement. It was described as barely holding together and needed to be adjusted daily to avoid too much pressure building up inside. So in the book and the miniseries, as Jack is falling into his madness, he naturally neglects his duties as caretaker, and thus during his murderous rampage, when it's discovered that the boiler had been left unattended and is about to blow, Jack breaks off his attack on Danny to try and release the pressure. But when Danny uses his shining ability to free Jack from the hotel's control momentarily, Jack decides to sabotage the boiler, turning up the pressure until it explodes, sacrificing himself and destroying the hotel in a huge fireball. Now that's the kind of ending you'd expect to see in a blockbuster movie. All the evil forces are destroyed, the murderous Jack is punished, and even has a bit of a redemption, and it's all ending in a giant climactic explosion. It's got Hollywood spectacle and wraps up the story in a bow, as opposed to the strange ending from the film. It's been said that King often writes his stories cinematically, so that's probably what he was going for, but it's such a powerful novel, it's really only when the book is contrasted with Kubrick's film version does the commercial nature of the ending stand out so glaringly. King's version has everything that would meet studio and audience expectations, and thus would be on the commercial end of the spectrum. Again, this isn't to say the ending is better or worse, it's just a different way of looking at it and comparing and contrasting the two. I personally like them both, but it's an important comparison to make, especially since people so often complain that it's the movie version that makes the more commercial creative choices, when the book was so much more nuanced and artistic. It's a good reminder that Hollywood adaptations aren't always the cliche they're painted as. But there's one more strange thing about the book's ending. If you're like me, you hate it when movies have a huge spoiler in the trailer. And I don't know if this has ever happened with other books, but when I read this book, this printing specifically, something happened that I've never seen happen before. This book actually spoiled the ending of this book. Yes, the ending was spoiled by its own book cover. After watching the movie in the 90s, I decided to read the book and found this copy laying around in my parents' house. It's the 1980 paperback reprint from Signet Publishing. It came out timed to coincide with the release of Kubrick's movie, and it takes its bold yellow cover design from the movie's teaser poster. But as I was reading it, well before the end of the book, Jack is tending to the boiler, releasing the pressure, and then it hit me. My mind immediately flashed back to the quote I read on the back cover, which praised the explosive ending. I was so shocked, I quickly closed the book to check the back cover to make sure I wasn't imagining it. And there it was, and the blurb from Cosmopolitan magazine even said literally explosive, just in case you didn't get the pun and it didn't spoil the ending for you. I thought, well, that's it, the boiler's gonna explode. I just sat there in stunned silence. I couldn't believe what had just happened. A book spoiled its own cover. Has that ever happened before? A book sabotaging its own reader experience. Who could have approved this? Seriously, someone at Signet should have been fired over this one. There actually have been dozens of cover designs for The Shining over the years, and I never saw another with such a dumb cover blurb. If you've ever heard of this happening before, let me know in the comments below, and check out more videos in the links in the corner at the end of the video. We'll see you here next time on Hero Journalism.